The morning Mara wore her only good coat to the Weston estate, the sky was the color of old pewter, and the wind came down from the hills like something that had a grudge. She had been awake since 4, not because she was nervous. She had long stopped being nervous about things she could not change. She had been awake because the water pipe in the corner of her room had frozen solid, and she had spent 40 minutes wrapping it in strips of cloth torn from an old petticoat, trying to keep the cold from pushing through the wall entirely. By the time she had finished, her fingers were stiff and pale, and the small stub of candle on her windowsill had burned down to almost nothing. She dressed carefully. The coat was dark green, bought second-hand from a stall in the market 3 winters ago. It had a small tear near the left cuff that she had repaired herself with a needle so fine it had left no visible mark. She had pressed it the night before using a flat iron heated over the fire grate, running it slowly over every seam until the wool lay smooth and even. She wore her hair pulled back simply, pinned close to her head, without ornament, because she owned no ornament worth wearing in public. She looked at herself in the small cloudy mirror above the washstand for only a moment, then she turned away and picked up her bag. Mara Holt was 22 years old and had been working as an assistant to a seamstress named Mrs. Oakes for nearly 4 years. The work was not glamorous. It consisted mostly of hemming, finishing seams, reattaching buttons that wealthy women had somehow managed to lose, and carrying bundles of completed garments through the streets to the grand houses that lined the upper end of town. The pay was modest enough that Mara kept careful account of every penny she spent, writing small columns of numbers in a notebook she kept tucked inside her coat pocket. She never went hungry, but she never had anything left over either. Life was a tight, careful thing, like a knot pulled just firm enough to hold without snapping. The Weston estate sat at the far end of a long gravel drive behind iron gates. Mara had been there twice before, delivering gowns for the eldest Weston daughter. She had never been admitted through the front entrance. Today was no different. She came around to the servant's side, knocked twice on the heavy wooden door, and was let in by a kitchen boy who looked barely old enough to have left school. Tonight was the harvest ball. It was the social event that the Weston family hosted every October, the one that drew families from as far as 2 counties away, the one that filled the local newspaper with a breathless account of who had attended, what they had worn, and whether Lady Weston's roses were as fine as the previous years. Mara was there to assist the household seamstress in making last-minute alterations to several gowns. She had been told she would be paid 2 shillings for the evening's work. She had said thank you and meant it. The house from the inside was warm and enormous, and faintly overwhelming, in the way that all such houses were. Mara had grown up moving through rooms like these as a servant and a delivery girl, and she had learned to keep her face very still in them. Not cold, just still. She noticed things without appearing to notice them. She noticed the chandelier in the entrance hall, which had been cleaned recently, because it threw light in sharp, clean angles across the marble floor. She noticed the fresh flowers arranged in tall vases along the corridor, white and cream and pale gold, the kind that cost more than her weekly wage. She noticed, too, the way the other servants walked, quickly, eyes forward, making themselves small in the space between the furniture and the walls. Mara did not make herself small. She simply walked at her usual pace, upright and unhurried, and found the seamstress's workroom, at the back of the house, where 3 other women were already bent over fabric and thread. The evening passed in a blur of pinned hems and hurried conversations, and the distant sound of music starting up in the ballroom on the other side of the house. At one point, one of the Weston daughters, a girl of perhaps 17, with bright red hair and a smile that had never had to work very hard for anything, swept into the workroom to have the waist of her gown taken in by half an inch. She stood very still while Mara worked the pins, but her eyes moved over Mara with the particular kind of attention that rich people sometimes gave to poor ones, the kind that was not really looking at a person so much as at the space a person occupied. "You're the one from the seamstress's shop on Fleet Lane, aren't you?" the girl said. Her name was Clara Weston, and she said everything in a voice that suggested she expected to be listened to. "Yes," Mara said. She held a pin carefully between her fingers. "You've been here before. I remember you. You always wear that green coat." Clara glanced at the coat hanging near the door. "It's quite old, isn't it?" It was not really a question. It was the kind of observation that was meant to mark a distance, to establish something about the order of things in the room. Mara looked up briefly, and then looked back at the fabric. "I'll have this finished in a moment," she said. Clara was satisfied with that. She stood quietly for another minute, and then, when Mara had finished, and stepped back, she looked at herself in the long mirror, and turned to one side, and then the other. "Fine," she said, and left without another word. Mara folded the small piece of leftover fabric and set it on the table. None of the other women in the room said anything. They had heard exchanges like that before. They had all had them. Later, when the guests had begun arriving in earnest, and the music had grown louder, and the sound of polished shoes on the ballroom floor had begun to drift through the walls, Mara was sent to carry a repaired shawl to one of the elder guests, who was resting in a small sitting room near the east corridor. She found the room and knocked, delivered the shawl, and was making her way back when she passed an open doorway and heard voices. She was not eavesdropping. She was simply walking, and the voices were there. "Said she works for old Mrs. Oakes, which tells you everything you need to know about her prospects," a woman was saying. The voice had the kind of confidence that comes from never having had to worry about prospects. "The one in the green coat," another voice said. She has decent enough manners for her station, I suppose, but she has that look about her, you know the look, as if she thinks she deserves to be somewhere better." A quiet laugh followed. Mara kept walking. She did not slow down, and she did not speed up. She kept her spine straight and her chin level, and she went back to the workroom and sat down and picked up the next piece of fabric that needed finishing. This was not new. This had been the texture of her life for as long as she could remember. These small moments of being seen and dismissed, being spoken about rather than spoken to, being reduced to a coat, or a job, or a lack of the right kind of connections. She had learned, over many years, not to carry each one of these moments like a stone. If she did, she knew, they would accumulate until they were too heavy to walk with. So she let them go. Not because they did not hurt, in some quiet way, but because she had decided, at some point in her teenage years, that the opinion of people who had never had to fight for anything was not a reliable measure of her worth. Still, there were nights, and this was one of them, as she sat in the warm workroom with the sounds of the ball filling the house around her, when the loneliness of it pressed in a little closer than usual. She was surrounded by people. She was inside a warm house. She was useful, even, and she was entirely alone in the way that only people who do not quite belong anywhere can be. She thought, not for the first time, about her mother. She had almost no real memories of her. A smell, perhaps, something warm and faintly floral, not a perfume but just a natural human warmth. A pair of hands, a voice that she could not now have described even if someone had offered her a sum of money to do so. Her mother had died when Mara was very young. 2 years old, she had been told by the woman who had taken her in afterward. Mrs. Garrett, a widow who ran a rooming house in the next town over, had looked after Mara until she was 12, not unkindly, but not with any particular tenderness either. When Mara had turned 12, Mrs. Garrett had found her a place in service at a local inn, and that had been that. Childhood ended. Mara had never known who her father was. She had asked once, when she was about 9, and Mrs. Garrett had looked uncomfortable and said, "Nobody who concerns you now." That had been the entirety of the conversation on the subject. Mara had not asked again. She had simply built a life, piece by careful piece, the way you might repair a coat with very fine stitches. Not glamorous, not the work anyone admires when they look at the finished garment, but the work that holds the whole thing together. The ball wound down after midnight. Mara helped put the workroom to rights, folded the spare fabric, put away the pins and needles and spools of thread. The household seamstress paid her the 2 shillings, plus an extra 6pence, because, she said quietly, it had been a long night and the work had been good. Mara said thank you and put the coins carefully into the inner pocket of her coat. The walk home was long. She did not mind. The cold had settled into something gentler by then, less sharp, more like a clean stillness. The streets were empty except for a cab moving slowly at the far end of the road, and a dog sleeping in a doorway. Mara walked at her usual pace, coat buttoned to the neck, the coins a small weight in her pocket. She was thinking about Tuesday. On Tuesday she had 3 deliveries to make, and Mrs. Oakes had mentioned there might be extra work if one of the larger families needed alterations done before the end of the month. If that came through, it would mean enough extra to replace the worn-out sole of her left boot, which had begun to let in water every time the ground was wet. She was thinking about practical things, the way she always did, because practical things could be solved, one at a time, with enough patience and careful planning. She was not thinking about the letter. She did not know about the letter yet. It would arrive the following Monday, damp from 3 days of travel, addressed in handwriting she had never seen, to a name she had never heard. It would be redirected twice before it reached her, passed along by people who did not know what to do with it, who had written her address on the outside, in different inks, and left it propped on the hall table of her boarding house, where the landlady, Mrs. Finch, had set it beside a jar of dried flowers, without a second glance. But that was Monday. Tonight Mara walked home through the quiet streets and listened to the sound of her own footsteps on the stone pavement, and did not yet know that her life was about to split open like old wood finally giving way under pressure. Not noisily, not all at once, but cleanly, along a seam that had been there all along, just waiting for the right moment to show itself. She turned the key in her door, climbed the 2 flights of stairs to her room, sat on the edge of her narrow bed, and took off her boots. The room was cold. The pipe in the corner was still wrapped in strips of petticoat. The candle she had left burning low had gone out while she was gone, and the room smelled of cold wax and winter air. She sat for a moment in the dark, just breathing, before she reached for the matches on the nightstand. The match caught on the second strike. The small flame lit the room in warm, unsteady gold. Mara set it to a fresh candle, watched it take, and then lay down on the bed fully dressed, because the blanket alone would not be enough tonight. She stared at the ceiling, which had a water stain in the far corner, shaped vaguely like a spread of birds. She had looked at that stain many times. Tonight it looked the same as it always did. She closed her eyes. Within minutes, she was asleep, quiet and still, the way people sleep when they are used to conserving everything, including rest. Outside, the cold continued. Somewhere across the county, in the office of a solicitor who would be dead within the week, a file sat open on a desk. It contained a birth certificate with a name. It contained a daguerreotype of a man and a woman standing in a garden. It contained a letter that had been written, sealed, sent, lost, found, and sent again across 17 years. In the file, clearly typed on the front page, was the name. Not Mara Holt, but Lady Mara Ashcroft of Thornfield. The name sat in the dark of the office, waiting, the way truth sometimes does, patiently, without hurry, knowing that it does not need to rush because it will still be true in the morning. The Monday came with sleet. Mara had been up early, as always, and had already eaten her breakfast of bread and weak tea by the time the sleet began hitting the window in small, sharp volleys. She was sitting at the little table near the window, going over her notebook, columns of numbers, careful and precise, when she heard the front door downstairs open and close, heard Mrs. Finch's voice saying something brief to someone, and then heard footsteps on the stair. There was a knock at her door. "There is post for you," Mrs. Finch said through the wood. Mara opened the door. Mrs. Finch was standing on the landing in her dressing gown, holding an envelope at a slight distance from her body, as if it were something she had found in the street and was not entirely sure about. The envelope was thick, cream-colored, and badly watermarked at one corner. It had several addresses written on it in different hands, crossed out and rewritten in a chain of redirections that spoke of a long journey. "Came with the morning delivery," Mrs. Finch said. "It's got your name on it, though I'll say, it doesn't look like any letter you'd normally be receiving." Mara took it. She looked at the front. The name written there, the original name, in the oldest ink, was not exactly hers. It was close, but not quite right. It said, Lady Mara Ashcroft, care of, and then an address that was not her address, not any address she recognized. "Must be a mistake," Mrs. Finch said. She was watching Mara's face with the open curiosity of someone who lived in close proximity to other people, and had long since given up pretending she was not interested in their business. "Possibly," Mara said. She closed the door quietly, and stood holding the envelope in the middle of her room. The sleet continued against the window. The room was very quiet. She set the envelope on the table beside her notebook, and looked at it for a moment. Then she sat down, picked it up again, and opened it. Inside was a single folded sheet of heavy paper, and, tucked behind it, something else. A small rectangle, stiff and faded, with the texture of old card. She set the card face down on the table, and unfolded the letter first. The handwriting was that of an elderly man, careful, slightly unsteady, the letters formed with the deliberate precision of someone writing something they considered important. The date at the top was over a month ago. It began without a salutation and went directly to the matter, which was, she would learn, characteristic of the man who had written it. It said, "If this letter reaches you, and I have reason to believe it will reach you eventually, even if it takes longer than it should, then there are things you need to know. Things that were decided about your life before you were old enough to have any say in them. I am a solicitor, and I am dying, and I have carried this particular weight for 19 years, and I will not take it with me. What follows is the truth as I know it." Mara read the letter 3 times. The first time, she read it quickly, her eyes moving across the lines without quite absorbing everything. The second time, she slowed down and read each sentence carefully, going back over the ones she had not fully understood. The third time, she set it flat on the table and read it with her finger tracing each line, the way she used to read difficult passages in the library books she borrowed when she was a girl, making sure she had missed nothing. When she had finished the third reading, she sat back in her chair and looked out the window at the sleet. Then she reached for the card she had set face down on the table and turned it over. It was a daguerreotype, old, with a slightly brown tint that all such images got over time, the edges soft with age. 2 people stood in a garden. The man was tall and had the look of someone who spent time outdoors, with a broad forehead and a calm expression. The woman was smaller, standing close to him, turned slightly toward the camera with an expression that was not quite smiling, but was not quite serious either. It was the expression of someone who was genuinely content and was not performing it for anyone. Mara looked at the woman's face for a long time. The eyes, the particular angle of the chin, the way she held her shoulders. Mara had seen those things before. Every morning, in the small cloudy mirror above the washstand, she set the photograph down very slowly, as if setting down something fragile. Her hands were steady. She was aware of her own breathing, even and slow, which surprised her slightly, because what she was feeling inside was not even or slow at all. It was something large and sharp, and entirely new, pressing against the inside of her chest, in a way that was not pain, but was not comfortable either. The letter had said that her mother was not the woman she had always vaguely imagined. Some poor, anonymous creature who had died young and left nothing behind. Her mother had been a woman named Catherine, who had been the wife of a lord named Edmund Ashcroft of Thornfield, who had died in a riding accident when Mara was not yet 2 years old. And after his death, the Ashcroft family, his relatives, his brother specifically, a man named Gerard Ashcroft, had determined that Catherine's daughter was an inconvenience. Catherine had come from a family of no particular standing. The Ashcroft money and the Ashcroft name, they had decided, should not pass to a child whose mother they considered beneath them. What they had done about this decision was the part that made Mara's hands go very still on the table. They had not taken the child from Catherine openly. They had applied pressure, the slow, quiet, suffocating kind that powerful people can apply to those with no resources to fight back. They had threatened to contest the marriage itself as improper. They had suggested, through a solicitor, that Catherine's position was legally precarious and that she would find herself without income or housing if she did not cooperate. They had made clear, in language that stopped just short of explicit, that Catherine's daughter would be better off, in their opinion, not existing as far as official records were concerned. Catherine had been alone and frightened, and had no money, and no family powerful enough to stand against the Ashcrofts. The solicitor who wrote the letter had been a young man working for Gerard Ashcroft at the time, and he had been the one to carry the paperwork back and forth. He had told himself it was legal. He had told himself he was simply doing his job. He had carried that story for 19 years, and had eventually stopped being able to believe it. So he had written the letter. He had written that the birth had been properly registered. He had written that he still had a copy of the original certificate. He had written that the estate of Thornfield had passed, after a period of legal confusion, to a cousin, a young man named Gerard Ashcroft's son, Frederick, who had been drawing on it freely for 16 years, on the basis that there was no legitimate heir. He had written the name clearly and without hesitation. Lady Mara Ashcroft of Thornfield, legitimate daughter of Lord Edmund Ashcroft, heir to everything that had been stolen from her before she was old enough to understand what theft was. Mara sat in her cold room in her boarding house with the sleet hitting the window and looked at the photograph of the woman with her eyes and her chin and her shoulders. Outside, a cart was moving slowly up the street, the horse's hooves loud on the wet cobblestones. Mrs. Finch was moving around below, and Mara could hear the distant sound of pots being shifted on the kitchen stove. Ordinary sounds. The sounds of an ordinary Monday. Nothing in the room had changed. The water stain was still on the ceiling. The notebook, with its careful columns, was still on the table. The worn-out sole of her left boot still let in water. Everything had changed. She folded the letter carefully and put it back in the envelope. She placed the envelope inside the inner pocket of her coat, in the same place where she kept her coins. Then she put her coat on, picked up her bag, and went out to make her Monday deliveries, because the deliveries needed to be made, and she had not yet decided what to do about the rest of it. But as she walked through the sleet with her head slightly down and her coat buttoned close, she was thinking about it, turning it over in her mind, the way she turned problems over, carefully, from every angle, without rushing, looking for the point where the solution lived. She was thinking about 19 years of a life built on a theft she had not known was happening. She was thinking about a man named Frederick Ashcroft, who had been comfortable for 16 years on something that did not belong to him. She was thinking about a solicitor who had waited too long, but had, in the end, done the right thing. And she was thinking, in the quietest and most private corner of herself, about the name written in the oldest ink on the outside of that envelope. Not Mara Holt. Not the girl in the green coat. Not the seamstress's assistant who wore borrowed shoes and lived on 2 shillings and a sixpence, and kept her notebook in her pocket, and let the small cruelties of people with nothing to lose from being cruel wash past her, because she had decided, long ago, not to drown in them. Lady Mara Ashcroft of Thornfield. She tried the shape of it, once, silently, as she turned the corner onto Market Street, with the sleet stinging her cheeks and her left boot beginning to let in water. It fit. Not like a costume. Not like something she was trying on. It fit the way the truth tends to fit when you finally let yourself see it clearly. Precisely. Without comfort, without apology, and without the slightest intention of going away. Alistair Cavendish did not travel to the south of England for pleasure. He traveled because there were matters that required his attention in person, and he had long since learned that letters and intermediaries handled certain things badly, which cost time, which cost money, which cost him a quality of patience he had never been overly blessed with. He arrived in town on a gray Thursday in November, 2 days after Mara had made her quiet decision to pursue what the solicitor's letter had promised. And he arrived in the way that he did most things, without announcement, without particular ceremony, and with the unhurried confidence of a man who understood that power does not need to announce itself. He was 40 years old. He was not handsome in the way that poets wrote about handsome, all smooth features and soft expressions. He was, instead, the kind of man whose face communicated things clearly, even when he was saying nothing. A strong jaw, eyes of a gray so dark they were almost black in certain lights. He wore good clothes, without appearing to think about them, which was itself a form of wealth, the freedom from having to think about what you wore, because the quality took care of itself. He had made the journey from his estate in Northumberland in 2 stages, and was satisfied with neither. The roads were poor, and his traveling companion, a young solicitor named Gerald Hewitt, talked more than was strictly necessary. The public luncheon on the Friday was not something Alistair had planned to attend. It was one of those civic events, a gathering of local landowners and merchants, and 1 or 2 elected officials, that happened regularly in every town of this size, and served primarily as an opportunity for people to see and be seen, and exchange opinions about the weather and the price of wool. Alistair had attended 3 such events in the past year, and found each of them equally unremarkable. He attended this one because Gerald had pointed out that the alderman he needed to speak with about a boundary dispute would be there, and it was more efficient to resolve the matter over a bad lunch than to arrange a separate formal meeting. The room was warm and crowded. Alistair found the alderman, had the conversation he needed to have, and was considering whether it was worth remaining for the rest of the meal, when his attention moved, without any particular intention, toward a woman on the other side of the room. She was serving water, not a role that would normally have drawn his eye, but something did. She was moving between the tables with a quiet efficiency that he recognized in people who had been doing precise, careful work for a long time. She was not rushing. She was not deferential in a way that was small or apologetic. When one of the guests at the nearest table said something that was clearly meant to dismiss her, she simply continued what she was doing, without changing her expression in any visible way, and she moved on. "You're staring," Gerald said beside him. "I am looking," Alistair said, which was true, and also the correct distinction. "At the serving girl?" "At the woman carrying the water jug," Alistair said. He watched her reach the far end of the room, exchange a word with a woman he assumed was the housekeeper, and then turn back. She held her head at an angle that was not proud exactly. She was not performing pride, but was simply, utterly undefeated. He had seen that quality in people before, usually in people who had been through a considerable amount and had come out the other side without becoming bitter about it, which was far rarer than people realized. "She carries herself like someone who has forgotten she is supposed to be ashamed," he said. Gerald glanced over. "She's a serving woman, sir. She works for the household. I know what she is," Alistair said. "I am noting what she also appears to be." He paused. "Find out her name for me." Gerald looked as though he might say something further, then appeared to reconsider. He was young and relatively clever, and had so far managed to avoid the mistake of questioning Alistair directly when Alistair was being specific about something. He nodded, set down his fork, and went to speak quietly to one of the hall staff. He came back with a name and a small number of additional facts. Her name was Mara Holt. She was an assistant to a seamstress on Fleet Lane, attending the luncheon in a contracted serving capacity. She lived in lodgings on Craven Street. She had worked in the town for approximately 4 years. Alistair received this information without visible reaction. He picked up his fork and finished his meal, and did not look at Mara Holt again. Not because he had lost interest, but because he had already decided to look into the matter more carefully, in a context that was less public. That afternoon, back in the rooms he had taken at the inn, he wrote a brief letter to his private inquiry agent in Leeds, and sent it with Gerald by cab. The letter asked for the full history of one Mara Holt, formerly of an address in the next county, and it specifically asked the agent to find any record of a birth registration, legal guardianship, or family connection that might not be immediately obvious from the surface facts. The agent was good. He had worked for Alistair for 6 years, and had never returned a report that was incomplete. Alistair expected to have preliminary information within a week. What he did not expect was to find it in 4 days, and to find not a partial picture, but an almost complete one, that made him very still in his chair for a full minute when he read it. He had known Edmund Ashcroft, not well, not as a close friend, but in the specific, reliable way that men know one another when one of them has acted honorably in a circumstance where honor was difficult. 7 years ago, when Alistair had been involved in a business arrangement that had gone badly wrong due to the dishonesty of a third party, it had been Edmund Ashcroft, attending the same meeting, entirely uninvolved in the dispute, who had stood up and said clearly and publicly that what he had witnessed was not what was being claimed. It had cost Edmund nothing materially. It had cost him a relationship with the third party, who was at the time a man of some influence. Edmund had done it anyway, because it was true, and because Edmund Ashcroft appeared to have been the kind of man who did things because they were true, rather than because they were convenient. Edmund had died less than a year after that. Alistair had attended the memorial. He had not known about the daughter. He had not known about any of this. He read the agent's report twice more, and then put it down on the desk, and looked out the window at the darkening afternoon sky over the town. Edmund Ashcroft's legitimate daughter was working as a seamstress's assistant on Fleet Lane. She was living in a single rented room on a wage that barely covered her expenses. She was being spoken of, by the people in this town who had been casually cruel to her for years, as a serving girl, a commoner, a woman with nothing to her name, and no claim to anything better. And somewhere on the Ashcroft estate in the north, a man named Frederick Ashcroft, Gerard's son, whom Alistair had encountered twice at estate meetings, and had found to be the precise combination of arrogant and mediocre that tended to produce a certain category of man, was living on something that did not belong to him. Alistair stood up from the chair and walked to the window. He stood there for some time, looking at nothing in particular. His face was the way it was when he was making a decision, not blank, not expressionless, but specifically quiet, as if everything inside him that was not directly useful had stepped back to make room for the thinking. He had not come to this town to correct an old injustice. He had come about a boundary dispute. He had a full schedule. He had arrangements. He had any number of things that required his attention, and that had nothing to do with a young woman who did not yet know how significant a letter had recently arrived at her lodgings. But there was a debt. Not a financial one. Not anything that could be measured in coin or property or contracts. There was a debt of the kind that men who take honesty seriously understand exists. The kind where someone did something right when they did not have to, and it mattered, and it was not forgotten. Edmund was gone, but Edmund's daughter was in this town, carrying water for wealthy people who dismissed her, wearing a repaired green coat, and walking with the spine of someone who had decided that her circumstances were not her character. Alistair pulled on his coat and went downstairs. He stopped at the front desk and asked the clerk to send a message to Gerald to clear 2 days from his schedule for personal business. Then he walked out into the cool evening air and started toward Fleet Lane. He did not find Mara that evening. The seamstress's shop was closed by the time he arrived, and a neighbor told him curtly that Mrs. Oakes and her assistant kept regular hours and were not to be troubled in the evenings. He accepted this without irritation and went back to the inn. The next morning, he was told something else entirely. The woman at the shop, a sharp-faced woman of middle age who identified herself as Mrs. Oakes, informed him, with some confusion, that she no longer employed Mara Holt as of the previous afternoon. She said this with the specific discomfort of someone who had done something that was not quite right and was not going to explain it. Alistair stood in the doorway of the shop and looked at Mrs. Oakes for a moment, calmly. "Why?" he said. Mrs. Oakes straightened. "That is a private employment matter." "What address is she at?" A pause. "Craven Street Boarding House, number 14. "But I don't see what business of yours." "Thank you," Alistair said, and left. He had understood, on the walk to Craven Street, what had happened. The news of Mara's inquiry into her identity, or some version of it, garbled and probably embellished, had reached people. That was always how it worked in a town this size. And people, when faced with someone who was below them, reasserting a claim to be something other than below them, tended to react in ways that were not kind. He arrived at number 14 Craven Street and knocked. A woman in a dressing gown answered the door. Behind her, in the narrow hallway, Alistair could see Mara Holt standing at the bottom of the stairs, still in her coat, a bag over her shoulder, clearly in the process of going out. She looked at him with the expression of someone who is composing themselves very quickly and doing it well. He looked at her steadily. "Miss Holt," he said, "my name is Cavendish. I knew your father. I think we need to talk." The look on Mara's face, when he said "your father," was something he did not forget quickly. It was not dramatic. It was not a collapse or an exclamation, or any of the performances that people sometimes made when receiving significant news. It was a single moment of complete stillness, as if every moving part of her had stopped simultaneously, and then she said, very quietly, "Come in then," and opened the door wider. Mrs. Finch, the landlady, stood in the hallway, looking between them, with barely concealed curiosity. Mara said, "Mrs. Finch, I'll use the front parlor if that's acceptable." And Mrs. Finch, who was apparently too surprised by the quality of the man at the door to object, said it was entirely acceptable, and went away. The front parlor smelled of old upholstery and coal smoke. There was a round table with 4 chairs and a fireplace that had gone cold. Mara sat down in the chair nearest the window and folded her hands on the table. She did not offer tea. She did not fill the silence with anything. She simply waited, and Alistair found himself thinking, for the second time in as many days, that this was a person who knew how to conserve herself. He sat down across from her and said what he had come to say. He told her that he had known her father. He told her that the inquiry agent's report had confirmed what the solicitor's letter almost certainly told her, that she was Edmund Ashcroft's legitimate daughter, that her identity had been deliberately suppressed, and that the Thornfield estate had been unlawfully occupied for the better part of 2 decades. He told her that he had a barrister available who was both willing and well-equipped to handle a case of this kind. He told her that he had 2 signed witness affidavits already in his possession that spoke to the legitimacy of the birth registration. He told her he intended to help her take back what was hers. She listened to all of this without interrupting. When he had finished, she was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Why?" It was the right question. He had expected it. He had prepared an answer that was honest and complete, Because she was the kind of person who would know the difference between a complete answer and a partial one. Because your father did something right once, when he had no reason to, and I had reason to be grateful for it, he said. And because I am aware that a man named Frederick Ashcroft is in possession of property that does not belong to him, and I find that kind of arrangement professionally offensive. He paused. And because you are clearly more than capable of handling this yourself, but you are handling it without resources, and resources are something I have. Mara looked at him for a long moment. Her eyes were steady and very clear. He had the distinct impression that she was reading him in the specific, calibrated way of someone who had spent a great deal of time reading people accurately and had gotten very good at it. You knew my father, she said. I met him at a business meeting 7 years ago. He struck me as a man of unusual integrity. I was sorry when he died. Another pause. You said you have a barrister. I do. And the affidavits. In my possession, as of 2 days ago. She looked out the window for a moment. The street outside was gray and still. A woman passed with a child by the hand. The sleet had stopped, but the sky had not decided what to do next. Yes, Mara said. She turned back to him, then yes. It was not an emotional yes. It was not gratitude heavy, or overwhelmed, or performed in any way. It was the yes of someone who had looked at a situation clearly, weighed what was being offered, considered the terms, and made a rational and confident decision. Alistair stood up. I'll have the barrister's clerk contact you tomorrow morning to arrange the first consultation. Mara stood as well. Mr. Cavendish. He stopped. Whatever debt you felt you owed my father, she said carefully. I want to be clear that I am not a charity case. What you are helping me recover is mine, not something you are giving me. He looked at her for a moment. I know that, he said. That is precisely the point. He left, and Mara stood in the front parlor of the boarding house with the cold fireplace and the smell of old upholstery, and felt something shifting in the ground beneath her. Not a collapse, not a fall, but a settling. The kind that happens when something has been unsteady for a very long time, and then, quite suddenly, finds a firm surface beneath it. She was not safe yet. She was not close to safe yet. There was a long, difficult road between this conversation and anything that could be called resolved. She knew that. She had never been the kind of person who confused the beginning of something with the end of it. But she had, for the first time in her 22 years, the right name, the right papers, and someone who intended to stand behind her while she used them. She went upstairs, sat down at the table, opened her notebook, and began to write out everything she needed to do next, in small, clear columns, precisely and without hurry. The train to York was the cheapest class available, which meant wooden benches and a window that did not close fully, and the particular cold that comes from air moving through a space faster than a person can get used to it. Mara sat with her coat folded over her lap and her bag between her feet, and watched the countryside move past in the gray November light. Bare fields, stone walls, the occasional farmhouse with smoke coming from the chimney. It all looked exactly like what it was, the north of England in late autumn, beautiful in a spare, unadorned way that did not try to be anything other than what it was. She had enough money for the fare and a small meal, and she had the solicitor's letter in the inner pocket of her coat, and she had spent the previous evening making a list of everything she intended to ask the junior clerk when she arrived at the offices of Hargreaves & Sons on Goodramgate. Gerald Hewitt, Alistair's young solicitor, had written ahead to confirm that the firm would receive her and that the relevant documents would be made available for inspection. Mara had read his brief letter 3 times before folding it and putting it with the other letter. 2 documents now, 2 pieces of a picture that was still assembling itself, but was beginning to show an outline she could recognize. She arrived at York in the early afternoon. The city was handsome and old, and clearly unimpressed by the weather, which was doing something that was not quite rain and not quite mist, but was both of them at once. She found Goodramgate without difficulty, found the brass plate on the door with Hargreaves & Sons engraved on it, and knocked. The clerk who opened the door was young, barely older than she was, thin-faced, with the look of someone who spent most of his time reading documents in poor light. He introduced himself as Mr. Aldous Pierce, junior clerk to the late Mr. Hargreaves, and ushered her into a small, wood-paneled office that smelled of dust and sealing wax and old paper. He was nervous. She noticed this immediately. He kept glancing at the door, and he had placed his hands flat on the desk as if to steady them. He was nervous in the specific way of someone who had been holding on to a piece of information that he was not entirely certain he should have been holding. "Miss Holt," he said, then he stopped. Or rather, he picked up a folder from the desk and set it down again. "Miss Ashcroft, you can start with the documents," Mara said. She sat down in the chair across from him and put her hands in her lap. "I've read the letter. I'd like to see the original certificate." He opened the folder. Inside was a collection of papers, some folded, some flat, all of various ages and conditions. He found the one she wanted and passed it across the desk to her. She picked it up carefully. It was a birth certificate, the real kind, the kind registered with the county, stamped and witnessed. The date on it was her birthday. She knew the date, because it was one of the few real facts she had carried from her early childhood, given to her by Mrs. Garrett, along with a very few other pieces of information. The name of the infant on the certificate was Mara Catherine Ashcroft. The father's name was Lord Edmund George Ashcroft of Thornfield, Yorkshire. The mother's name was Catherine Ann Mervyn, wife. Mara read it from top to bottom. Then she set it down on the desk and folded her hands again and looked at the clerk. "Tell me the rest," she said. What followed was nearly 2 hours of careful, detailed information, delivered by Aldous Pierce, in a voice that grew steadier as he went on, as if the act of telling the truth aloud was physically settling him down. He told her what his late employer, Mr. Hargreaves Sr., had told him in writing before he died, a formal written account, self-incriminating and meticulous, in the specific way of someone who has carried guilt for a long time and wants to put it down carefully rather than just drop it. The late Mr. Hargreaves had been the solicitor engaged by Gerard Ashcroft to manage the aftermath of Edmund Ashcroft's death. He had been present at the meetings where pressure was applied to Catherine. He had drawn up the documents that Catherine had signed under duress, documents that had effectively waived her daughter's claim to the Ashcroft estate, on the grounds that the marriage was, the Ashcroft family argued, questionable in its legal registration. This had been false. The marriage was entirely legitimate. Hargreaves had known this when he drew up the documents and had drawn them up anyway. Catherine had died 8 months after signing the papers. She had taken sick with a lung infection that winter and had not recovered. She had died in a lodging house in Leeds, without anyone present who had known her before the loss of everything. The child, Mara, had been passed along to a neighbor's cousin, who had passed her to Mrs. Garrett, who had taken her in with the brief information that she was an orphan, and there was no family. There was family. There had always been family. There was a cousin, Frederick Ashcroft, currently residing at Thornfield House, who had been aware since his 21st birthday that he was drawing on an estate to which he had no legitimate claim. Gerard Ashcroft, his father, had told him the truth before dying, not out of honesty, but out of the particular cold pragmatism of a man who wanted his son to be fully informed of the nature of the arrangement he was inheriting. Frederick had, 3 years ago, actually filed a legal counterclaim preemptively. It was registered with the county courts as a declaration of hereditary right, which was its own kind of boldness, or its own kind of desperation, depending on how you looked at it. He had done it because he had learned, through connections Mara did not yet know about, that someone was asking questions about the Ashcroft estate and its original heir. He had filed the claim before Mara even knew she was an heir. Mara sat very still when Aldous Pierce told her this. She was thinking clearly. She was not angry in the hot, distracting way. She was angry in the cold, useful way, which was the only kind of anger worth having. "He filed it 3 years ago?" she said. "Yes. And this letter from Mr. Hargreaves, when did he write it?" 6 weeks ago. He had been unwell for some time, and I believe he—" Aldous paused. "I believe he wished to stop being the person who had not told the truth." Mara looked at the folder on the desk. "How many of these original documents do you have?" "The birth certificate, 2 sets of witness statements from the original marriage registration. The original estate deed, naming Lord Edmund's legitimate heir as receiving the estate in full upon his death and the death of his wife, with no conditions attached. The documents Catherine signed, I have those as well, but they are legally void because they were signed under coercion, which can be demonstrated." "Can it?" "Yes. Mr. Hargreaves wrote very specifically about the meetings. He included dates, times, and the names of everyone present. He also included his own direct account of what was said, including the specific language used to pressure Mrs. Ashcroft. It is, frankly, a very thorough account. Mara nodded. She thought about a man who had carried a guilt for 19 years and had spent the last weeks of his life setting it down as precisely and thoroughly as he could, as if he were doing the final piece of work in a long career and wanted it done right. She thought about her mother, who had been 24 when she signed those papers, who had been alone and frightened and had known, probably, that she was signing away something she could not afford to sign away, but had seen no other choice. She thought about Frederick Ashcroft, who had filed a preemptive legal claim 3 years ago because he had learned someone was asking questions. She thought about herself, 22 years old, here in this small office in York, with the birth certificate in her hand, and a long road ahead. "I want copies of everything," she said. "Every document in that folder. I want them made today, and I want to take them with me." "Of course," Aldous said. He stood immediately. "And I want the originals kept in the safest place this office has." "They're in the vault already," he said. "They have been, since Mr. Hargreaves sealed his written account." She nodded. "Good." She left the office at 3:30 in the afternoon, with a leather case containing copies of every document Aldous Pierce had shown her. The case was heavy, and she held it close against her body as she walked through the old city streets toward the train station. The not-quite rain was still falling. The streets smelled of wet stone. She had enough money left for the train home, and a penny for the newspaper stand at the station. She bought the newspaper, tucked it under her arm, and sat on the platform bench and waited for the train. She did not read the newspaper. She sat with it in her lap and looked at the track and thought. By the time the train arrived, she had decided 3 things. The first was that she needed a very good barrister, and that the one Alistair had offered was the fastest route to one. The second was that she needed to understand everything about the legal counterclaim Frederick had filed, the exact wording, the exact grounds, and the exact weakness of it. The third was that she was going to need to be very patient. This was the thing people did not understand about patience. It was not passive. It was not waiting and hoping and keeping your hands folded. It was active, deliberate, strategic. It was the decision to move carefully and completely rather than quickly and partially, because quick and partial left gaps, and gaps could be exploited, and she was not in a position to have gaps exploited. She looked at the leather case in her lap. 19 years of someone else's careful work in her favor. A dying solicitor's conscience, expressed in ink on good paper, preserved in a vault. She had the truth. She had the documents. She had an ally with resources, and a reason to stand behind her. Now she needed to use all of it. The train pulled in with a hiss of steam, and the crowd on the platform began to move. Mara picked up her case and her bag and joined it, moving at her usual pace, upright and unhurried, through the steam and the noise and the cold northern air, toward whatever came next. The news moved the way news always moved in a town like this, sideways, person to person, changing shape as it went, arriving at each new ear in a slightly different form but carrying the same essential message. Within 48 hours of Mara's visit to the solicitor's office in York, a version of the story had reached the drawing rooms of every family of any social standing in the district. The version that reached the Weston household told it as comedy. Clara Weston brought it to the Friday salon with the look of someone delivering an excellent gift. "You won't believe," she said, settling into her chair with the satisfaction of a person who had good information, "that the seamstress's girl, you know the one in the green coat who always looks as if she thinks she's better than the room, she is claiming to be the heir to the Ashcroft estate in Yorkshire." The 3 women in the room received this with the particular combination of disbelief and appetite that such news always produced in such rooms. "Ashcroft," said Mrs. Patton, wife of the wool merchant. "That is a serious estate." "Which is presumably why she is claiming it," Clara said, smiling. "You don't think there is anything to it," said another woman, Mrs. Hale. Clara shrugged with the ease of someone who has already decided what they think. "She's a serving girl. She works for Mrs. Oakes. Worked, I should say, because apparently she's been let go. She lives in Mrs. Finch's boarding house on Craven Street. Whatever she's claiming, she found some letter and has got herself confused, or someone has taken advantage of her." She paused to let this settle. A sparrow deciding she's an eagle, as someone put it rather well. The room found this satisfying. Certain stories fitted comfortably in certain shapes, and the shape of a poor woman mistaking herself for someone important was a very comfortable one for rooms like this. Mara did not know about this particular conversation. She did not know about the note that was slipped under her door 3 mornings later. A plain piece of paper with no name on it, printed in careful handwriting. Sparrows do not become eagles by wishing. She found it when she came back from an errand, and she read it standing in the hallway, and she was quiet for a moment. Then she went upstairs, folded it carefully, and pinned it above the mirror in her room. She pinned it there because she found it useful. Not in the way the person who had written it intended, which was presumably to discourage her. She found it useful as a reminder that the people who underestimated her so consistently were the same people who had underestimated her mother. Her mother had not had the resources to prove them wrong. Mara intended to be different. The Monday after the salon, Mrs. Oakes came to the door of the boarding house. Mara received her in the hallway. Mrs. Oakes did not come in. She stood on the step and held herself slightly apart from the conversation, as if she were managing the distance between them carefully. She said that there had been some discussion in the local business community. She said that the business community had certain sensitivities about the establishments it was associated with. She said that given the current, questions surrounding Mara's situation, she hoped Mara would understand that. "You want me to withdraw my application for the full-time position," Mara said. Mrs. Oakes looked slightly relieved. "It's not personal." "I understand," Mara said, and she did understand. She understood it precisely, including what it said about Mrs. Oakes, and about the business community, and about what kind of pressure was being applied from what kind of direction. "Good morning, Mrs. Oakes." She closed the door. She stood in the hallway for a moment. Then she went upstairs and added a line to the notebook. "Find alternative income. Short term." 2 days later, Mrs. Finch increased the weekly rent by 3 shillings. She did it in writing, with the careful wording of someone who had been advised by someone else to make it official. Mara read the note and made a quick calculation. She could cover it for 6 weeks. After that, it would be very tight. She added this to the notebook as well. The pressure was not subtle, but it was not crude either. It was the kind of pressure that worked on people who did not have resources to resist it. It was designed, she understood, to make her feel isolated, financially unsafe, and socially unsupported, to the point where the idea of pursuing a legal claim against the Ashcroft estate would begin to seem not worth the cost. It might have worked on someone who had not spent 22 years getting used to having very little. Mara sat at her table in the evenings and worked through her situation with the same methodical care she gave to everything. She went through her accounts. She had savings, small but real. She had the leather case of documents, which were secure. She had Alistair Cavendish's card on the table beside her notebook. She had a consultation with the barrister, a Mr. Owen Fitch of Gray's Inn, scheduled for the following Thursday. What she also had, which was perhaps the most important thing, was clarity. She was not confused about what was happening or why. She was not frightened in the way that confusion makes people frightened. She was clear-eyed about the situation, which meant she could make good decisions in it. She had not always had that quality. It had been given to her, she believed, by a life that had required her to look at difficult realities without flinching, because flinching was a luxury she had never been able to afford. Now that quality was not a hardship but a tool, and it was a sharper one than most of the people applying pressure to her would ever understand they were up against. She spent her evenings reading through the copies of the documents from York, making notes in the margins of her notebook, preparing questions for the barrister. She went through the counterclaim Frederick Ashcroft had filed. She had obtained a copy through Gerald Hewitt, and she read it with great care. It was long and legally complex, and dressed in the language of legitimate hereditary right. But underneath the language, if you read it slowly enough, you could see its weakness. It relied almost entirely on the documents her mother had signed, the ones that were signed under coercion, the ones that the late Mr. Hargreaves had specifically, in writing, described as signed under coercion. Taken those documents away, and what Frederick had was an argument that the estate's rightful heir had simply never existed, which was contradicted directly by the birth certificate, and by the marriage records, and by the witness statements about the marriage registration. Mara circled the relevant sections with a pencil and wrote notes beside them in her small, precise handwriting. On the Thursday, she took the train to the city and met Owen Fitch in his chambers. He was a tall man of about 50, with the manner of someone who had spent many years in rooms where important decisions were made, and had stopped being impressed by them. He read through the documents she had brought while Mara sat in the chair opposite and watched him. He read slowly and carefully. He did not make small sounds of reaction or approval. He simply read. When he finished, he set the papers on the desk and looked at her over the tops of his glasses. "This is solid," he said. "Not easy, but solid. The coercion account from the late Mr. Hargreaves is your strongest piece, assuming its authenticity can be verified, and I believe it can, given the specificity of the detail. It directly invalidates the documents Frederick Ashcroft's claim relies on." "What is the timeline?" Mara said. "Filing a counterclaim against his preemptive declaration, which is what we'd be doing, requires a formal hearing before the county magistrate. Getting that hearing scheduled, assuming opposition from the other side, is likely to take 3 months. After that, the hearing itself could last several days." "What are the risks?" He considered the question seriously, which she appreciated. "The main risk is that they apply pressure to witnesses. The junior clerk in York, Aldous Pierce. Yes, he's young, and he may not have stood in front of opposition counsel before. The experience can be difficult. I'll speak to him," Mara said. "What else?" "They may try to introduce new documents, challenge the marriage certificate." "On what grounds?" "Any grounds. The grounds don't need to be convincing, only disruptive. They want to create delay and confusion, because delay and confusion cost money, and your resources are limited." He paused. "Mr. Cavendish tells me he is prepared to cover the legal costs." "I know," Mara said. "I have asked him not to cover them in a way that puts me in his debt." Owen Fitch looked at her for a moment with an expression that was not quite a smile, but was something adjacent to one. "He told me you might say that," he said. "He suggested a formal loan arrangement at 0 interest, to be repaid from the estate after the ruling." "That is acceptable," Mara said. She left the chambers an hour later with a clear understanding of the strategy, a list of actions she needed to take before the filing date, and a quiet, settled feeling in her chest that she recognized as the feeling of being in motion, not running, moving, deliberately, precisely, toward something real. She walked back through the city toward the train station. The light was already fading, the way it did in November, early and sudden, the afternoon becoming evening without sufficient warning. She passed the windows of shops, beginning to light their lamps. She passed a woman selling hot chestnuts from a brazier on the corner, and bought a small bag of them because she had not eaten since breakfast, and because they were warm in her hands. She ate the chestnuts on the walk to the station and thought about what came next. What came next was the part that would test her. Not the legal part. The legal part, however complex, was simply a problem, and problems could be worked through. What would test her was the period between now and the hearing, the weeks during which the pressure would continue to be applied, during which the note above the mirror and the increased rent and the lost work would be joined by other things, designed to make her feel small and unsupported, and unworthy of what she was claiming. She thought about her mother, who had been tested in exactly the same way, and had not had Aldous Pierce's documents, or Alistair Cavendish's resources, or Owen Fitch's strategy. Her mother had had none of it, and still, she had raised her daughter in those 2 short years well enough that the daughter, somehow, had grown up with exactly the quality of spine needed for exactly this situation. Mara did not know how. She had no memory of it. But she believed it was true. She believed it the way she believed the birth certificate was real. Not from sentiment, but from evidence. The evidence was herself. She arrived at the station as the last of the daylight went. She found her platform and stood waiting, her hands warm from the chestnuts, the leather case beside her feet, the note above the mirror, the notebook with its columns, the barrister with his strategy, the duke with his resources and his debt of honor. She was ready. She had always been ready. She had just been waiting, without knowing it, for the tools to catch up with the person she already was. The first postponement motion arrived on a Tuesday, filed by the legal firm of Caston and Bright on behalf of Frederick Ashcroft, on the grounds that the respondent required additional time to obtain new evidence. Owen Fitch sent Mara a note informing her of it, brief and even in tone, as if postponement motions were precisely the kind of thing one expected and was entirely prepared for. Which, Mara understood, they were. The second postponement motion arrived 11 days later. Different grounds this time. A procedural argument about the jurisdiction of the county magistrate's court in cases involving estates of a certain value. This one had a little more weight to it and required Owen Fitch to spend 3 days preparing a written response, which he did without apparent agitation. He wrote to Mara with a copy of his response and a brief explanation. The argument was not without legal basis, but was also not the kind of thing that changed outcomes. It was designed, he said, to slow the process and add cost. The third motion was purely administrative, a request to have certain documents re-authenticated through a court-appointed process. This one made Aldous Pierce telephone Gerald Hewitt in something approaching a state of alarm, because one of the documents at issue was his late employer's written account, and the re-authentication process would require Aldous to appear before a court officer and answer questions about the circumstances of its composition. Aldous was, at this point, beginning to understand what he had agreed to. Mara took the train to York again, not because she had new legal business there, but because she wanted to speak to Aldous in person. She found him in the office on Goodramgate, thinner than the last time she had seen him, with the look of a man who had not been sleeping well. He had organized his desk with extreme care, every document in a neat pile, every folder labeled, as if order were the only available defense against the chaos of the situation. She sat down across from him and said, "You are going to be asked questions by the other side's solicitor. They will try to make the account seem unreliable. They will ask you about your employer's state of mind in his final weeks. They will suggest that a dying man's account of events from 19 years ago is not credible." "I know," Aldous said. "The account is accurate," Mara said. "You told me that yourself." "It is," he said. "Absolutely. Every name, every date, every detail. I have been through it. It matches the records we have." "Then you tell them that," she said, calmly, without elaboration. "You answer what you are asked, and you do not add anything beyond the question." He looked at her. He was 25, perhaps. He had a face that showed what he was feeling fairly clearly, and what he was feeling currently was a combination of anxiety and something that might have been resolve, still soft at the edges but there. "You've done this before?" he said. "No," Mara said. "But I have spent my life in rooms where someone wanted me to feel smaller than I was, and I have learned that the way through it is to be extremely accurate and extremely quiet." Aldous was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Right," in a tone that suggested he was deciding something. "Right, yes, I can do that." She believed him. She went back to the train and thought, on the way home, about how many people in this process had needed to find something in themselves that they had not previously known was there. Aldous, with his resolve. Mrs. Finch, who had one morning appeared at Mara's door with the extra 3 shillings in an envelope, and said, with the air of someone overcoming something private, "I should not have done that. Keep the original amount." She had said nothing further, and neither had Mara, and the matter had been left where it stood. The postponements were eventually denied. The magistrate, a man named Judge Calvert, who had the reputation of being technically precise and personally impatient with anything that wasted the court's time, rejected the third motion with a written note that described it as procedurally redundant. Owen Fitch had read this note to Mara over the telephone with the closest thing to satisfaction she had ever heard in his voice. The hearing was scheduled for a Monday in early February. It was to begin at 10 in the morning. On the Friday before, one of the witnesses Owen Fitch had prepared, a retired county clerk named Herbert Alston, who had been present at the original marriage registration of Edmund and Catherine Ashcroft and had signed as a witness, sent a letter withdrawing his statement. The letter was careful and apologetic, and said only that he had reconsidered and felt, on reflection, that his memory of events from 20 years ago was not reliable enough to serve as testimony. His memory had been entirely reliable when Owen Fitch had spoken to him 6 weeks ago. Mara received the news by telephone. Owen Fitch's voice was steady. "It happens," he said. "We don't know what form the pressure took. We don't need to pursue it. What we need is a replacement." "There was a second witness at the registration," Mara said. She had read the marriage record several times, and she knew it. A woman named Constance Bell. She signed below Herbert Alston. "We identified her," Owen said. "She is elderly, 73, and she lives in a village outside Ripon. The question was whether she was well enough to—" "Has anyone asked her?" Mara said. A pause. "No." Then I will go and ask her, Mara said. She went the following morning, Saturday, taking 3 trains and a hired trap for the last 4 miles, through countryside that was cold and quiet, and entirely indifferent to the urgency of her journey. The village was small, 40 or so houses, a church, a public house with a fire visible through the window. She found Constance Bell's cottage on the far side of a small stream, knocked at the door, and was received by a small, white-haired woman, with sharp dark eyes, and the manner of someone who had seen a great deal, and was not easily startled. Mara told her what the situation was, all of it, from the beginning, without softening anything. Constance Bell listened without interrupting, sitting in her chair by the fire with her hands folded in her lap, nodding occasionally. When Mara had finished, Constance said, I signed as witness to that marriage. Edmund Ashcroft was a good man. I knew his first name personally, because my husband worked on the estate for 11 years. She paused. I know what happened to his wife afterward. I heard it at the time, and it sat badly with me. Another pause. I'll come. She said it the way people say things when they are certain and do not need to elaborate. Mara said thank you, and Constance said you are welcome, and they sat together for a few minutes longer, while Constance made tea, and they talked about the village, and the weather, and the quality of the roads in this part of the county. It was, Mara thought, the most ordinary conversation she had had in months. She got back to town late on Saturday evening, reported to Owen Fitch by telephone that morning, and spent Sunday rereading her own prepared statement for the hearing, until she could feel every sentence of it. Monday came cold and clear, the sky an empty pale blue that gave no warmth. Mara woke at 5. She dressed carefully in the best clothes she owned, a dark blue skirt and jacket she had made herself the previous summer from good wool, repaired and pressed until they sat correctly on her frame. She did her hair with the same care she had always given it, simple, neat, nothing that called unnecessary attention to itself. She ate breakfast slowly. She arrived at the courthouse at 9:15. Owen Fitch was already there with Gerald Hewitt and a young assistant carrying a case of documents. Alistair Cavendish arrived at 20 minutes to 10. He said nothing when he saw her, just looked at her for a moment with the direct, calm attention that was characteristic of him, and nodded once. They went in. Frederick Ashcroft was already seated on the other side of the room, with 3 solicitors and a small gallery of supporters. He was 38, not physically unlike Edmund Ashcroft in build, though with a softness around the jaw that spoke of different habits. He did not look at Mara when she came in. He was speaking quietly to the nearest solicitor, and he kept his eyes forward and slightly elevated, which was the specific angle of someone who did not want to appear to be avoiding looking at something. Judge Calvert entered, at precisely 10 o'clock, and the room came to order. The hearing moved through the opening statements, and the presentation of documents, and the first round of testimony, with the particular deliberate pace of formal legal proceedings, which Mara had read about, but had never experienced from the inside. It was not like the dramatic proceedings in the novels she had borrowed from the library. It was more precise than that, and more patient, and it had the quality of something being assembled piece by piece, rather than arrived at in a rush. Owen Fitch was methodical. He presented the birth certificate. He presented the marriage records. He presented the estate deed. He presented Aldous Pierce's testimony about the late Mr. Hargreaves's written account, and Aldous gave that testimony with the careful, accurate, quiet delivery that Mara had suggested to him in York, and he was cross-examined by Frederick's lead solicitor for 40 minutes, and he did not waver. Constance Bell gave her testimony briefly, and with the same settled certainty she had shown in her cottage. She was 73 years old, and she had been present at the marriage, she said, and she remembered it clearly, because it had been a bright morning in June, and she had remarked to her husband afterward that it was a fine couple. She was cross-examined, and she answered each question directly and without embellishment, and when the cross-examination ended, the solicitor sat down, looking as if he had pushed against something solid, and found it did not move. The late morning session paused for a short recess. Mara sat in the corridor outside with Owen Fitch, who went through his notes. She was very still. She had been still all morning. She was not performing stillness. She was genuinely quiet inside, in the specific way that clarity produces when it is the result of preparation, rather than chance. "How is it going?" she said. "Well," Owen said. He almost never used that word in its evaluative sense, she had noticed. Their foundation is thin without the coercion documents, and we have established the coercion clearly. Their strategy now will be to complicate. He was right about the complication. When proceedings resumed, Frederick's lead solicitor spent the better part of 2 hours attempting to introduce doubt about the consistency of the Hargreaves account with the original signed documents, suggesting discrepancies in date notation and questioning the mental condition of a man writing in his final weeks. It was technically accomplished, if ultimately thin. Owen responded to each point in writing, without drama, pointing to specific corroborating evidence. Then the magistrate invited Mara to speak. She had prepared her statement at the kitchen table of the boarding house over several evenings. She had written it, rewritten it, cut it down, made it clear. She had read it aloud to herself until the pacing was right, and every sentence did only one thing. She stood up. The room was very quiet. She had the impression of many people paying attention, which she had become accustomed to over the past months, but had not become entirely neutral about. She did not look at Frederick Ashcroft. She looked at Judge Calvert, because he was the relevant person in the room. She said, "I am not asking for sympathy. I am not asking for anything to which I am not legally and factually entitled. I am presenting to this court a complete and documented account of my birth, my parentage, and the circumstances by which my identity and my inheritance were concealed from me without my knowledge or consent for 22 years. She continued. She went through the facts in the order she had prepared them, without emphasis, without drama. Dates, names, documents. She referred to the certificate, the account, the witnesses. She described what had been done to her mother in terms that were precise and clear, and left nothing ambiguous. When she reached the end of her statement, she said, "I have not raised my voice once in the course of this proceeding. I have not asked this court to dislike Frederick Ashcroft or to feel sorry for me. I have asked only that it look at the evidence. I am confident that the evidence is sufficient." She sat down. The room was quiet for a moment longer than strictly necessary. Then Frederick's solicitor rose, and the proceedings continued. But something had shifted. She could feel it, the way you can feel weather changing when the air pressure drops. Not visible yet, but real. She sat back in her chair, her hands still in her lap, and waited for it. Judge Calvert did not deliver his ruling immediately. He took the matter under advisement and said that his written ruling would be issued within 14 days. This was standard, Owen told her. It was not a sign of uncertainty, but of proper process. 14 days. Mara went home and continued her routine. She found occasional sewing work through a contact of Gerald Hewitt's wife, which covered her costs. She read. She walked. She wrote in her notebook. She did not talk about the hearing to people who had not been there, partly because there was nothing useful to say while they waited, and partly because she had learned, over the months of this process, that the fewer people who knew the details, the fewer opportunities there were for those details to be distorted. Alistair was in the north, but he wrote twice. His letters were brief and specific, which suited her. He did not ask how she was feeling. He asked what she needed. She wrote back once with an answer, and once with a question about the property management structure of the Thornfield estate, because she had been thinking ahead and wanted to understand what she would be inheriting in practical terms. He replied to that letter within 3 days, with 4 pages of detailed information. The ruling came on a Thursday, 12 days after the hearing. Owen Fitch telephoned her at 10 in the morning. She sat at the table with the telephone receiver in her hand and listened. He read it to her, the formal language of legal judgment, and then he said, at the end, "In summary, Miss Ashcroft, you have won." She said thank you, put down the receiver, and sat at the table for a long moment. Then she picked up her notebook and a pencil and began, in small clear columns, to write out what needed to happen next. The news was in the local paper by Friday. It was in the county paper by Saturday. By Sunday, the calling cards had begun to arrive at the boarding house. The same families who had attended the harvest ball, who had sat in comfortable rooms and called her a sparrow, who had spread the story as a joke in the weeks before the hearing. Flowers arrived from 3 different addresses, including a particularly large arrangement from the Weston household. Mara read the cards. She put them in a neat pile. She had the flowers sent to the hospital, as she had already decided she would, because the hospital could use them, and the alternative was keeping them in a room that was about to be vacated anyway. She wrote a brief note to Mrs. Finch. saying she would be leaving at the end of the week, and thanking her for the accommodation. She meant the thanks genuinely. She packed her belongings, which did not take long because there were not many of them. The green coat, the notebooks, the leather case of documents, a small number of books, her sewing things, and the few items of clothing she owned. It all fit in 2 bags. She unpinned the anonymous note from above the mirror and looked at it one more time. Sparrows do not become eagles by wishing. She folded it once and put it in the inner pocket of her coat, beside where the coins used to live. She walked out of the boarding house on the last day of February, with her 2 bags, and her coat, and her name, which was no longer Holt, and got into the cab that Alistair's agent had arranged, and began the journey north. Thornfield House was larger than she had imagined, which was a thing she had prepared herself for by deliberately not imagining it at all. It was a stone house on a rise above open moorland, built in the previous century with the kind of confidence that came from having money for long enough that it felt permanent. The grounds were winter bare and wide. The oak trees that lined the drive were old enough that Mara understood her father would have walked under them as a boy. She arrived at 3 in the afternoon, in the last of the winter light. The housekeeper, Mrs. Crane, met her at the door, a composed woman of about 60, who had apparently been employed at Thornfield for 20 years, and who had, she told Mara later, known from the evidence of the estate accounts that something had been wrong for a very long time. She showed Mara through the principal rooms without ceremony, naming each one and its function and its condition, and Mara followed and listened and looked at everything carefully. Frederick Ashcroft had vacated the house 5 days before her arrival, as the ruling required. He had taken personal belongings and nothing else, because the ruling had been specific about what was and was not his to take. He had left without meeting Mara, which she had expected. There was, at this stage, nothing either of them needed to say to the other, and she did not pursue it. She spent her first week at Thornfield, going through the estate's records, with the estate solicitor, and with Alistair, who arrived on the 2nd day and stayed for 4 days, which was explained officially as a visit to review the estate's financial position, and which involved, in addition to several hours of practical discussion about land management and accounts, a considerable amount of walking the grounds in the early mornings before the household was fully active. On the 3rd morning, in the field below the East Oak line, Alistair said, without particular preamble, "You are managing this better than most people who have just inherited an estate would manage it." "I've been preparing for 2 months, Mara said. "That's not what I mean." She looked at him. He was looking at the oak trees, his hands in his coat pockets, his breath visible in the cold air. He was not uncomfortable with what he had said. He was simply saying it, the way he said things, directly, without decorative framing, and apparently without caring whether it was the conventional thing to say. "What do you mean?" she said. He turned to look at her. "I mean that most people, in your situation, would either be performing gratitude or performing triumph. You're not doing either. You're thinking about drainage ditches." She considered this. "The drainage ditches are an urgent problem," she said. "I know. The North Field has been poorly managed for at least 3 years. You can see it in the records. I noticed that too." They walked on for a moment in silence. The moorland beyond the fence was very still. The grass, the particular pale gold of winter grass that has not had color for months. A bird of some kind was moving along the far tree line. "Thank you," Mara said. He glanced at her. "For the debt you felt you owed my father," she said. "You were right that it was not charity. You were right that it was just. But it also required something from you. Your time, and your resources, and your reputation, because you were known to be associated with me during a period when a great number of people were laughing at me." She paused. "I do not take that lightly." Alistair was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Your father would have done the same." "I know," Mara said. "That is exactly why I said thank you." She turned and walked back toward the house, and after a moment, she heard his footsteps fall in beside her, unhurried, at her pace. 3 years later, the outbuildings on the south side of the estate had been converted into a trade school for working women, the first of its kind in the region, admitting 12 women at a time for courses in accounting, dressmaking, estate management, and correspondence. Mara ran it as its director, not its patron, which meant she attended the classes, approved the curriculum, interviewed the instructors, and reviewed every student's progress herself. She also kept her notebook. The columns were longer now, more complex, covering multiple streams of income and expenditure. But the handwriting was the same. Small, clear, precise. Alistair Cavendish visited in the spring of the 3rd year. He had visited 4 times before, always officially, always with defined business as the stated reason. This time there was no business that required the visit. He arrived on a Tuesday, stayed for 3 days, and on the 2nd evening, after supper, while they were sitting in the library with the last of the firelight doing most of the work of illuminating the room, he asked her to marry him. He did it in the plainest possible language. He said that he had found her more interesting than anyone he had known in some years, that he valued her mind and her character and her company, and that he was aware she might have any number of good reasons to decline. He said he was asking anyway because he was 53 years old and had learned that there was very little point in not saying clearly what you meant, particularly in situations where the other person was almost certainly the most observant person you had ever met, and had probably known what you intended to ask for at least 4 months. Mara looked at him for a long moment. "I'll think about it," she said. He accepted this without objection. He did not press. He picked up his book and went back to reading, and Mara picked up hers, and they sat by the fire in the comfortable quiet that had developed between them over 3 years of irregular but genuine correspondence, and the occasional 4 days of practical conversation. She did not make him wait very long. She gave him her answer the following morning over breakfast, in the same plain language he had used the night before, because they were both people who found direct language more comfortable than the alternatives. The formal announcement went out 2 weeks later. A journalist from the county paper asked her, at a public function in the spring, what she would say to the people who had called her a commoner with nothing to her name. She thought about it for a moment. She thought about the frozen water pipe, and the 2 shillings, and the green coat, and the note above the mirror, and the train to York in the sleet, and the courtroom, and the first morning she had walked across the Thornfield grounds with the keys in her hand and felt the weight of them settle into something real. "They were not entirely wrong," she said. "I had nothing given to me. Everything I have, I carried." She was 31 years old. The trade school had its 2nd intake that autumn. The Northfield drainage had been resolved the previous summer. Her notebook had a new column now, one she had not had space for before, for things that were going well. The column was fuller than any of the others. She was not done. She had never expected to be done. She had expected, from the time she was old enough to understand what she was up against, that the work would simply change character as she moved through it, harder in some ways, easier in others, always requiring the same qualities of patience and precision, and the specific, non-performative courage of someone who does what is necessary without requiring the world to notice that it was difficult. The world had noticed, but that had never been the point. The point was the work. The point was what you built. The point was the students in the South Outbuilding learning to keep accounts, and the moorland in the early morning, with the light coming in low and gold over the old oak trees, and the notebook with its careful columns, and the note she still kept. She had transferred it, after arriving at Thornfield, from her coat pocket to the top drawer of her desk in the estate office. Sparrows do not become eagles by wishing. She had stopped finding it funny. She had started finding it true, in a way its author had not intended, because she had never wished. She had worked. She had been precise and patient, and absolutely, unrelentingly clear about what was real, and what was hers, and what she intended to do about it. That was the difference. That had always been the difference. That was the whole story, carried in a frozen room, and a broken pipe, and a letter redirected 17 years, arriving eventually in the right hands, which were the only hands that had ever known what to do with it.